Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, are killer robots a realistic threat? We hear reports of things like drones using AI in war zones, but how advanced is the technology generally now, and what sort of guardrails are in place? Well, I'm joined today by Laura Nolan, an engineer who quit Google some years back because of that company's involvement in helping to develop a drone warfare system that could have been used by the US military. Laura, we'll look at your own case and what you did about it in a minute, but what generally is the state of play with killer robots when we think about this technology right now? What kind of things are we talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, when you say killer robots, obviously that brings to mind visions of, the Terminator and these kinds of super intelligent AI robots that are, coming for us all. And that's not really how it is. The term that we normally use, particularly in diplomatic events and these kinds of things, is autonomous weapons or lethal autonomous weapon systems. So the lethal means weapon systems that are particularly designed to target people or inhabited structures or vehicles. Whereas if you don't have the lethal, that means that you're building systems that are intended to attack other machines, so drones, missiles, and so forth. So I'm very sad to say that these systems are actually very real. Not the Terminator bit, but the lethal autonomous weapons systems bit.
And when you say that, are we talking about stuff like drones, or what's the ambit there?
Yeah, so when you say drone, actually, that's interesting because people think a drone always means something that's in flight, but actually a drone just means any sort of mobile machine that can move around and do things. So you have your flying drones, but you can also have robots. You can have like little mini tank things. You can have things with wheels. You can have, in particular, when you're talking about autonomous weapons systems, there's a great interest in underwater vehicles, so mini submarines and submersibles.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about that because we are used to seeing, for example, say bomb disposal units, those little autonomous vehicles. I'm not even sure if they're totally autonomous. Maybe they're more remote control, but you do see them the odd time when there's a terrorist alert in some countries. You'll see the little robot kind of moving in.
Yeah, they're generally controlled. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so if that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, frankly, I'm slightly surprised that we haven't seen more of that over recent years, because we've had quite a bit of technology in place to arm those devices and use euphemisms like crowd control or anti-terrorist stuff. But I can't really recall to mind that many times when I've actually seen or heard something like that being used. But maybe is this just being developed in the background?
Yeah, being developed in the background is a huge part of it. We think that there have been some cases where weapons with a high degree of autonomy have been used. So one example that is this thing called the Harpy or Harop, which is a drone which is built by the Israeli company IAI. That is designed to take out your enemy's air defense systems. So what it does is it flies around in a prescribed area and it looks for radar signals that would signal that a particular location has got a anti-aircraft installation on it. And then it basically does a kamikaze attack. It has a payload.
Yeah.
Then there's another weapon, which is of great concern at the moment, which is called the Kargu. This is made by a Turkish company called STS. And this is a small quadcopter drone. According to the marketing materials, and companies are never very upfront about exactly what these things are being used for, but reportedly this thing has facial recognition software. It can certainly recognize human beings, and there was a report to the United Nations that about 2 years ago this was used in Libya to basically track a group of retreating fighters and to attack them and kill them. So we have certainly got systems that are in development, and on top of that, of course. When we talk about weapon systems, we're talking about, sort of physical autonomous machines that can, go out in the world, fly about, drive about, be underwater, whatever they're doing. But then we also have these very concerning AI targeting systems that we're seeing, such as Lavender, which has been used in Palestine at the moment.
Just explain that. What is that technology?
This technology is this is a computer-based system. It's sort of a decision support system for the military there, and they use it to generate lists of buildings which should be attacked. There is an organization called Plus 972 that did a large. They did a large investigation on this. They spoke to a number of people who are on the inside of the Israeli military about this. This system, the way it works is it basically ranks potential buildings that they could target, and by effectively the amount of distress that it would cause to.
I see. Yeah.
So they're talking about prominent buildings, buildings with a large number of people, kind of religious buildings, that kind of thing. So they're trying to do the most damage to the sort of the population morale,
which kind of leveraging AI and analysis to help form attacks. I did see there was one long report by the New York Times about 3 or 4 weeks ago where one of the journalists went out into Ukraine and he spoke to some of the Ukrainian soldiers, and some of them had developed drones and they had attached Raspberry Pi, small computers, and I think they were using them as a combination of kamikaze drones, but also they were trying to develop systems using the basic Raspberry Pi computational power to identify patterns or identify objects and vehicles, and to be able to semi-autonomously at least make decisions on what to do or whether to attack. And that the justification used for it by the soldiers involved was, well, look, we're hopelessly outgunned. We cannot compete with the same type of firepower that the Russians have. This is the only way we can do it.
Yeah, to my knowledge, and I haven't read that specific report that you mentioned there, but to my knowledge, that most, if not all, of the drones that have been used in Ukraine to date have generally been remotely operated rather than autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
Or where autonomy is used, it's autonomy in navigation rather than what we call the critical functions, which are target selection and the decision to use force.
And that's important.
So, for example,
that's an important distinction.
It's hugely important. So in terms of the disarmament debates, we're not very concerned about weapons that can autonomously navigate to a particular point that a human operator has selected. We're concerned about the weapons that are actually selecting that target and making that decision to use force.
Because it seems almost like a trivial bit of technology. If you think about any smartphone that you have bought in the last 4 years, they now come with quite a decent level of face recognition technology. You could go look through your photo folder, for example, and it'll give you a choice as to who to pick. It'll show you faces and it'll pick out photos. I mean, the technology has actually been there for a while. It seems like a trivial step to then, add 2 and 2 and 2 together to get a device or a machine that will do all this. So I know that Boston Dynamics, which people will recognize from all of those advanced videos that you see on social media and robot dogs and all that sort of stuff, they and a few other companies seem to have come out and said they won't be developing their general purpose robots for military or for aggressive or offensive use. Is that all we have to rely on at the moment? That we're not seeing more advanced kind of killer robots?
Yeah, I mean, well, there is no international law that says that you can't have them, or that actually provides any guidelines, which I think is a problem, and I think that we should have some guidelines around this. I think it's probably the case that we're going to see these systems, but there's a lot of degrees of risk in terms of civilians and also in terms of friendly fire kind of accidents. So you mentioned that our phones for the last several years have had pretty good image categorization technology on them. So categorization is one of these things that the machine learning kind of the computer vision systems that we have are quite good. And so recognizing a face is a categorization problem. That's saying, is this image in the category of photos of Adrian Weckler or Laura Nolan, or is it not? And that's how those things work. You feed in a bunch of example photos. It sort of in the background, it extracts this sort of uses induction to sort of develop this model of what you look like, or what different people look like, or what cats look like, or what tanks look like. And that's one thing. So kind of categorizing what's in an image is not perfect. And if you look out there, you'll find that there's a lot of people who are working on different ways to sort of to subvert or attack those kinds of systems to get them to categorize wrongly. So that's one particular risk. But think about it. Military targeting is a hugely complicated problem, and it's a lot more complex than saying, well, is this a tank, or is this a gunboat, or is this Osama bin Laden, or what have you, right? And the reason it's more complicated is this. When you are planning an attack, you have to think about two things, according to international humanitarian law, the laws of war, or laws of armed conflict. And those are proportionality and distinction. So distinction basically says, is this target that I'm attacking a valid military target? So, are you a military base, or are you a military vehicle, or are you somebody who's taking active part in that in this conflict? Those kinds of
versus a hospital, for example.
Versus a hospital, or versus, say, a pickup truck with a bunch of non-combatants in it, or versus somebody who is an individual who is just not part of the conflict.
And it's another podcast entirely for us to wonder whether those rules are being adhered to in the theatres of war that we see at the moment. But your point is well taken. Yeah.
Well, just because the rules aren't always adhered to doesn't mean we shouldn't have the rules. I mean, we see murders, but we don't say, well, there's no point in not having a law against murder. So the problem is when you look into this sort of question of, is this a legitimate attack, you have to not only distinguish whether something is a valid target, which isn't always sort of visually apparent based on just a flat image. You also have to say, well, what surrounds this? Is this right beside a school full of children, or is this in a busy urban area? Is it will the damage that I do to civilians and civilian objects justify the military advantage that this attack gives me? And you'll notice there that I'm comparing civilian damage to civilians and civilian objects to military advantage. And these are sort of intangible things. Civilian death you can potentially add up and sort of put a number on that, but it's a bit more complicated to say put a number on damaging, say, water purification infrastructure. That's
but that's so the distinction you're drawing there, and the light that you're pointing to in terms of international law is about what is justifiable or not in the terms of damage and in the terms of what happens in a war. But even if you could design a system that could reliably, let's say, to a certain degree of confidence, distinguish between a hospital and a military target, there is an adjacent question, is there not, over whether or not such a system should still be green lit. Like, it's kind of crossing a line. Even if we have a reasonable degree of confidence that the killer robot, the killer drone, whatever it is, won't actually target the wrong targets, or won't kill civilians. Even if it did actually, just if you bear with me in the example, if it did actually kill the legitimate, allowable according to the laws of war targets, isn't there a separate question, though, as to whether it's still okay to use that technology?
That's a really good question. And now we're getting into ethics. And funnily enough, I spent 2 years during the pandemic getting an ethics degree at DCU, just entirely because I was trying to sort of figure out the ramifications of this question. So, certainly it gives people the ick. People feel very uneasy about letting a machine make that decision to take life. People think it's problematic. It's harder to sort of it's harder to sort of make a watertight ethical argument about it, and making arguments with regard to ethics is difficult anyway. So people have tried to argue that it's sort of against human dignity to be killed by a machine, but other people argue that, well, it's kind of against human dignity to be killed in war anyway. So,
and maybe I guess the argument in favor would be, well, if you are the country who is at war and let's assume that you imagine that it's a just war and that you're pursuing a war for noble purposes, that you are maybe sparing the lives of some of your own citizens, that maybe you're avoiding a draft, that maybe you are, avoiding the extreme case, and I state the extreme case of a World War I scenario where you're just literally wave after wave of human fodder into something that might yield 20 yards in a week.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, if you read, there's a very good book called Just War, where Michael Walzer, I guess, who's sort of the giant of the field of military ethics, he spends many chapters going into the ins and outs of proportionality and distinctions, all these things that we're talking about. And then there's a chapter at the end where he basically says, you know what? I mean, if a country sort of feels itself at existential risk of destruction, they're just going to do whatever they see fit. But Ukraine aside, relatively few countries on the earth are in that position at any one time. So that's not, I guess, that's not really, I think, where we should be trying to sort of draw the general principles around this.
You see, I can see a scenario, honestly, politically, where semi-autonomous or even autonomous machines with some offensive capability, let's take a step back from, killer drones or killer robots with a capital K, some offensive capability might be introduced into the body politic for, say, anti-terrorist reasons, or for, say, crowd control. There was an example that when I was Googling all this over the last few days that emerged. Apparently in Dallas in 2016, they attached a device, an explosive device, to a bomb robot, one of these anti-detonation robots, and they wheeled it over to where the suspect was and they detonated it. And, that probably wasn't autonomous. That was remotely controlled, I would say. But you're getting into the foothills of it there, aren't you?
Certainly, there are some common concerns because between remotely controlled attacks and autonomous attacks, but autonomy does create a difference, and the difference that it creates is, I think, primarily a case of good decision making. And this is where I come into this, because I've built a lot of software, and I've built autonomous software, not autonomous weapons, but I've built a lot of autonomous software to primarily run other software and to run computer networks and computer data centers. And the thing about building autonomous software is it goes out into the field into a very complex world. And even the word of a computer network or a data center is quite complex, but a battlefield is so much more complex. You're sending this out into the world with a bunch of decisions that you've sort of made for it. Before you've sent it out, you've sort of built the rules of engagement for this thing, and it's impossible really to predict in a complex world what your systems are actually going to do when faced with the reality. So I personally think that when we build these systems, we're always going to have a degree of uncertainty about what they're going to do. And the more complex the tasks that we ask them to do, the higher the chance that they will screw it up. And so this is where the guidelines that the disarmament community that has sort of coalesced under the banner of Stop Killer Robots, what we're asking for is that if autonomous weapons are built, they should not target human beings, because human beings are we're not inherently military objects. It's very, very difficult to tell the difference between a person who is a valid military target and somebody who is not, because it's very contextual and it's very much to do with that person's behavior, whether they're taking that sort of ongoing part in a conflict or not. And even uniformed military, there are times when they're not valid targets. For example, if they are wounded. Or if they're, say, military chaplains, I don't believe they're also valid targets as well. There's a lot of complications with that. So we're asking that that such systems should have very significant boundaries. They should be able to only operate in a particular geographical range. That range should be free of civilians, or as free of civilians as possible. So places like not in a city, for example, or in an inhabited area. It's just too dangerous. And the target profiles that these weapons should be designed to attack should be purely military. So things like tanks rather than things like vehicles, which might be civilian vehicles.
Is that a really hard one, though, to get across the line? Economically, politically? I mean, the military is probably always going to be one of the biggest investors and consumers in new technology and robotics. And isn't it inevitable that every single military within its target range and within its field of operations will actually target people? If you look at the wars that are ongoing at the moment, and sometimes you look at what we regard as being advanced and somewhat ethically advanced armies, like the US, for example, and it's probably another podcast than that, but they will often target individuals who they say are ringleaders or who they say are causing havoc. So it's a tough one, isn't it, to say that an autonomous military device must not ever target a human?
Well, I mean, you can cast a lot of questions about whether or not their decapitation strategy actually works. There are a lot of people who study this who think that actually what it does is it mostly annoys people, and so it creates more.
For sure, and there's a whole other thing about that. I'm just wondering about the reality of how armies and militaries and countries, because all these militaries tend to have more or less the support of civil society in most Western countries. So you're talking about a body politic here, and you're talking about people who often it's the population that will want somebody eliminated as well. It's quite an ugly realpolitik.
Well, I mean, we should divorce the question of autonomous weapons from the question of whether or not these kinds of decapitation strikes are a valid military strategy. I think they're not, but I think we should divorce these two things.
Yeah.
And we should remember what is the point of disarmament. So there's sort of two rationales. So you can do disarmament for humanitarian reasons. You can say, okay, we won't use cluster bombs because cluster bombs, they kill children because they don't all explode, and children pick them up years later and they explode themselves. We won't do this for humanitarian reasons. But then there's a more hard-headed form of disarmament as well. So think about, say, the various nuclear treaties that have come around. It's potentially in the interest of any given country if they want to go and develop their own nuclear deterrent. But because as a sort of as a people as a whole, we don't think it's a great idea for every country on the face of the earth to have its own nuclear arsenal. It increases for all of us. It's not a good thing. It's a
deeper instinct for survival and self-preservation that we all have. We all know that if somebody launches a nuclear attack, then that, apart from the devastation that itself would cause, that could trigger more attacks, and we're all worse off.
Yeah, so it's a collective decision. So a number of countries have come and they've signed various nuclear treaties in order to diminish these risks, and even the US and Russia have signed.
And is that the spirit that you're hoping might prevail with autonomous weapons?
I hope so, because it's not just one country that will build these. Every country that has a significant military will think about whether or not they should be building these. And as you say, when you're thinking solely about what's my personal or my national advantage, why would you not want to have weapons that can potentially help you to overcome a numerical disadvantage?
I know.
But you have to think not only about what weapons I have, you think about what weapons my adversary has. And I think when you're thinking about building these kinds of autonomous weapons that I believe will be unpredictable, I believe that they will cause not only civilian casualties, but they're likely to cause friendly casualties, so casualties to one's own military. That might be in the area. I think that there's a lot of risk here, and I think that countries should think very carefully, not about whether they want to develop these weapons, but whether they want every other country on the face of the planet to develop these weapons. I mean, look at how armed drones spread. The US starts using these relatively heavily around the start of the 21st century. And I think my figures are about 5 years old now, but about 5 years ago, I remember reading that 78 countries at that point had developed armed drones. So you can see how fast that spread.
Yeah, so one country gets it and then the others don't want to be left behind. Now, to be fair, you haven't just talked the talk on this, you have walked the walk as well, because you were an engineer with Google and you were one of quite a few actually who were very unhappy about that company helping to develop technology or supporting the development of technology. Can you explain?
They were developing the technology.
Yeah. Can you explain what Project Maven was?
Yeah. So in 2017, the U.S. government they created this new team called the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team. And the idea of this organization in the US military was to basically contract out with with technology companies to build a system or build various systems that would help sort of propel them into 21st century warfare, I guess. So one of these things was Project Maven. And I know that Google had this contract, and I believe that other companies, such as I believe Amazon and another company called Clarify, and potentially some others, were also involved in similar contracts. Google's contract with Maven was. It was initially an 18-month contract for, I believe, about $10 million, so quite small at Google scale. And the idea was that Google was going to develop a machine learning system that would take in aerial drone footage. They call it wide area motion imagery. This is very, very super high resolution footage of a particular area under surveillance. And Google's technology was going to be used to basically extract sort of information of interest from there. So things like people moving from place to place and also vehicles. Those were the main things that it was looking for. So Google was also going to build various user interfaces into this data. So things like I saw a design document where they would be able to sort of click on a particular house in an area that was under surveillance, and sort of they would see a social graph of what other houses or what other buildings the people in that house are sort of having communications with. So things like that.
Did Google still have the logo of Don't Be Evil at that time?
Google got rid of the "Don't be evil" mantra during the whole furore around Maven. It sort of quietly dropped it from whichever webpage it was on.
You were very unhappy about all this.
I am unhappy about it. As we talked about earlier, I don't think that decapitation strikes work, and I don't think that it's ethical to keep whole areas of countries halfway around the world from you under surveillance for more than a decade at that point. They've been doing sort of drone surveillance over certain areas for probably 15 years.
So you walked?
I did walk, yes. Yeah. I had a lot of conversations with management about it, even going up as high as the VP of the Google Cloud organization at that time. She and I had a one-to-one, and nobody could convince me that this was actually.
What was her argument for you to stay? What did she say to you?
I guess her argument was the same as I was hearing quite consistently from Google's leadership at that time, which was that they wanted to be involved in this in order to what was their exact wording? It was something like reduce to avoid people being harmed, or avoid our soldiers being harmed. So I mean, no disrespect to US soldiers, but they're of course not my soldiers, and I don't really, like I said, I don't.
Did you believe that argument?
No, I don't believe that argument. First off, I mean, I think that the basic fact was that the US was doing no good being in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and as we saw, they decided the same thing themselves.
Were you working for Google in the US at the time, or here in Dublin?
Here in Dublin, I worked in Docklands. Yeah.
So you then left after you left the company after that, and that was a bit of a career risk, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, it's yeah. I mean, Google had been my dream job, and I'd been there for 5 or 6 years at that point, and I'd still have a lot of good friends from that time. I learned a huge amount. It's it didn't destroy my career, luckily. Yeah,
I was going to ask, did you find that when you did leave, did it hurt your chances of getting another decent job?
No. I was lucky enough to find. Funnily enough, I had 5 job offers in hand when I went looking after that, so I had no problems with that. I think a lot of people actually agreed with my stance
Mm.
on what I said and what I did. And of course, the job market was very good at that time, which is not so much at the moment. So,
Yeah, because I've interviewed Meredith Whittaker a few times, and she was, of course, very prominent. This Signal
yeah.
CEO, she was very, very prominent in making the same point essentially that you were making, and she's gone on to great things. You went on to work for Slack after that, and other companies as well. Looking back and putting that alongside what's happening now, do you think that the point has been made that there's less development of quote unquote killer robots now than there was 5 years ago?
I should just say that I'm no longer at Slack, and I'm not speaking for Slack.
Oh no, I understand that. You went on to work for Slack, and then you worked for someone else, and now you did a bit of freelance. My point was just that you did manage to go and get a good job at another very decent big company. But do you think that we are in a better position now than we were 5 years ago, or have things changed?
Well, in terms of the development of autonomous weapon systems overall, I would say we're 5 years further into the future. We've had reports of the Cargus being used.
Mm.
We've had reports of all sorts of other things happening. We have this Lavender system. This is not an autonomous weapon, but it is a targeting support system in use in Israel, which is very Palestine, which is extremely worrying. So in terms of the development of autonomous weapons, we're 5 years further along to wherever we're going, and that's not great.
Mm.
With no guidelines in place, with no international regulation. In terms of what people in the tech industry can do about it, as I said, we're in a market where jobs are weak, layoffs are ongoing. I think it's much more difficult for somebody who might be in my position in this time to walk. I think it's asking a lot more of people, which is why I continue to speak about this issue.
Yeah, and just finally, I'm kind of intrigued because if you were working here in Dublin for Google, we don't often think of Ireland as being a country where any of this happens. We think of this as something that happens in the US, maybe Israel, maybe Russia, maybe the UK, France. Do you think that the development of this kind of technology happens here in Ireland?
They were not developing the core Maven technology here in Ireland, and the way I got involved in it is I was asked to help to build air-gapped data centers, and I was working on Google's infrastructure at that time.
Yeah.
So, as many people continue to do in Dublin, so
Yeah.
it wasn't so much developing the software, but making changes to the Google infrastructure that would allow them to run the software. And this was going to be the second 18-month contract, which would have run from, I believe, that would have been from early 2019 onwards.
Yeah.
So, when you're looking at systems that are built in these sort of big cloud companies, and we have substantial presences of Microsoft and of Amazon here. You don't know when the software that you're going to write is going to be taken and used for some military purpose. I don't know if you remember around the same time as Maven, there was this other this much bigger project actually called JEDI, the Joint Enterprise Defense Initiative, which was a cloud contract which Google, Microsoft, and Amazon all bid on. My recollection, and you may want to go fact check this, but my recollection is that Microsoft won it, and then Amazon sued because they wanted a piece of the pie. But the systems that JEDI would have included potentially everything from machine translation to all sorts of machine learning systems to just generic compute. And you don't know what these systems are going to be used for. I mean, a friend of mine who served in the Israeli military said, in his view, the most lethal systems that they were using in order to support their military adventures was probably the spreadsheet. So
yeah, the spreadsheet. Just a point on that JEDI. I just looked it up now, and it's from 2021. From The Verge, the U.S. Defense Department has cancelled the $10 billion JEDI cloud computing project that it awarded to Microsoft in 2019, saying the controversial program's design, quote, no longer meets its needs, unquote.
Well, what I think happened there was they decided they wanted to contract out in order to, save time, to avoid some of the big weighty procurement processes, and then they find themselves bogged down in the courts because the cloud companies were fighting over the tasty treat of this contract. So in actual fact, it was going to be slower than their regular procurement. So I mean, it's pretty funny.
Laura Nolan, thank you very much for joining us today and explaining all that. I think you've brought a huge amount of clarity and context and background to this conversation. So thank you once again for joining the Big Tech Show. Rory Bone was on sound for this podcast. JJ Clark produced, and I'm Adrian Weckler. You have been listening to or watching or doing both with the Big Tech Show. We'll talk to you soon.